Hi, I'm Lizzie, and today I'm talking about how to get pregnant while breastfeeding. This is a follow-up to one of my most popular videos, Can I Get Pregnant While Breastfeeding? And in this video, I'm going to talk about 3 specific things. Number 1, I'm going to talk about our experience with ecological breastfeeding and kind of a day in the life of how I breastfed my daughter in order to delay my fertility. Number 2, I'm going to talk about the 2 things that I changed to get my fertility back when we were ready, way ready to have another baby. And number 3, I will talk about the method that we used to monitor my ovulation once my periods had returned. And finally, I'll wrap it up with some tips and advice that you could try if you are hoping to get pregnant while breastfeeding. So let's get started. Okay, so first of all, I am going to talk about what ecological breastfeeding looked like for us and how it worked. So when I talk about ecological breastfeeding, I'm talking about a particular style of breastfeeding that is scientifically shown to delay your fertility. So if you're interested in learning more about that, check out my video called Can I Get Pregnant While Breastfeeding? And I dive into all of the 7 standards of ecological breastfeeding, and those are 7 things that you can do if you are wanting to depend on breastfeeding to naturally space your babies. So check that video out. I won't run into that today because that takes a bit of time. So today I'm talking about our experience and really what breastfeeding looked like in our life to make sure that we were sticking within those 7 standards of ecological breastfeeding. So I got my first postpartum period 2 or 3 days before my daughter's 2nd birthday. That is a very long time. The average for mums who are doing all 7 standards of ecological breastfeeding is 14 months, and I went 24 months without a period. So it was definitely very effective for me, and we have an almost 3-year age gap. We were really happy with how it worked. I was 19 when I got pregnant with my first, and that's really what led me to look into ecological breastfeeding. I am young. I have plenty of time to have babies, and we wanted to get started with our family. We chose to get pregnant as soon as we got married, and we really wanted to let our babies space out naturally, but I didn't really want to get pregnant 6 months after having a baby. I kind of freaked out at that idea of having like lots of really little kids. So that's how I got interested in ecological breastfeeding. I wanted to know, how can I reliably space my babies? And we have got a 3-year age gap, which is so much more than I ever expected. So for us, ecological breastfeeding meant lots of regular feeds. And I mean regular. People didn't believe me when I said I fed my daughter every hour for the first 18 months of life. Like, I'm not joking. It's not an exaggeration. Now, obviously, as she got older, those feeds got shorter and shorter. So from about 12 months, really, those feeds were 5 minutes, 10 minutes. And it was more of a snack, a calm down, a regroup, and then she'd go off and do her thing. So early on as a baby, I was in the chair breastfeeding a lot. She was a really slow feeder. She would happily sit there and feed for 45 minutes. So we did lots and lots of regular breastfeeding, and I loved that. And I did not have an easy run of breastfeeding. Breastfeeding was not easy for me, and it was really, really painful for the first 6 months. So don't think, this was just something that was super easy and super comfortable. It hurt. I was in agony for the first 6 months, and I have another video about nipple thrush and all the things that I went through if you're interested in hearing that story. But it was just really important to me. Those long hours of feeding didn't bother me, and the really regular feeding didn't bother me. People talk really negatively about snack feeding, and if you just made them wait longer, then they'd feed for a longer time and then go longer without a feed, which is true, but I was happy with snack feeding. It worked really conveniently. It meant we could just sit down, stop for 5 minutes, and then keep going. So ecological breastfeeding was lots of regular feeding. I fed her every hour during the day and every 2 hours overnight. And I did that right up until 18 months when we night weaned. We'd night weaned for 2 months and she got really, really sick. And so I resumed night feeding at that stage. It wasn't as often because she'd already been night weaned for 2 months, so she wasn't waking up every 2 hours. But I was still kind of doing a couple of night feeds because I just felt really sorry for her. She was really, really sick. And we got to 22 months postpartum, 2 months shy of her second birthday, and I still hadn't had a period. And by that point, my husband and I were like, we really want to have another baby. Like, we really, really want to have another baby. And we decided to officially night wean. That was going to be the end of it. Even if she got sick, you know, I wouldn't be resuming night feeding. And I took the full 8 weeks to get my period back. My body is definitely very sensitive to breastfeeding. So night weaning is one of the things that we changed to get my fertility to return. And that was the main thing that we changed. And I was really hoping that the night weaning would be enough to get my period back. But I did do a few things to space out her day feed. The first thing that I did was I stopped offering for her to have a feed during the day. The second thing I would do is distract her. When she asked to feed, I would attempt to distract her. The third thing that I did was get really conscious about offering food. Sometimes that worked and sometimes she's like, no, I'd like Susie, please. So just using those very gentle, simple tactics, she went from feeding every hour with those snack feeds to feeding 2 to 3 hourly. I would regularly go, oh, when did you last feed? Like, it was 4 hours ago. And part of that was her growing up, but part of it was that that really gentle process of teaching her that you eat rather than feed when you're hungry. So to recap, the 2 things that I changed were encouraging her day feeds to space out and completely night weaning her. And my period did return just before her second birthday. We decided to use ferning as a method of monitoring ovulation. I was aware from Sheila Kipley's book on ecological breastfeeding that a breastfeeding mother's cycle is irregular once it returns. And with irregular cycles, you can ovulate much later, which really affects your due date. And because you basically get 12 days overdue, and in the home birthing program that I'm in, you aren't allowed to home birth after 12 days. With a private midwife, you're allowed to as long as the baby's still fine. They do some monitoring to make sure that baby's healthy. But in this program, you're not allowed to. At 12 days, maxes out and you're going to have to be in hospital. They don't insist on induction, but it is going to have to be a hospital birth. And so I really wanted to monitor ovulation because I knew that irregular cycles could really affect your due date. So I will grab the microscope and show you what we used. So this is an OvuPlan microscope. I don't care what brand you buy. This was just the cheapest. This one was $30. The other one was $60. So we went with this one. And it's basically a little microscope that you get in here. And it has 2 sides. And it's got a little teardrop on this side, or saliva drop really, but it looks like a teardrop. And every morning when you first wake up, you take a sample of your saliva and you put it on that screen and you leave it to dry. So I just left it, and then much later in the afternoon, I would come back to it. And then on the purple side, you put your eye up to it and you look through it and you look towards a light source. And you'll basically see patterns in your saliva. So during your infertile period, it won't look like anything really. I had a few bubbly things kind of throughout it. But as you approach ovulation, your estrogen levels rise, which causes a ferning pattern in your saliva. And so 3 or 4 days before ovulation, you'll start to see sticks in your saliva. And literally, they're like little branches, and they have little branches coming off. And the closer you get to ovulation, the more branches they have. And the day of ovulation, it seriously is it's a ferning pattern, just sticks on steroids. They're everywhere. So it's a really good way of knowing that you have ovulated, but also knowing that in the lead up. I highly recommend that if you are breastfeeding. My first cycle was 34 days long, which was absolutely confirmation that my cycles were going to be irregular. and I was monitoring my ovulation, and I did ovulate a week later than I expected. And so in the end, I decided to get a dating scan, and that confirmed that I was a whole week behind the baby's growth schedule, which I didn't freak out about because I knew that I'd ovulated later. So we were able to adjust my dates, push it back a whole week, and hopefully that will help at the end if I do go overdue. So to wrap up, I want to talk about specific tips and ideas that you could use if you are wanting to get pregnant while breastfeeding. Now, obviously, these pieces of advice are different for different age groups. Most of my advice is for people with a baby over the age of 12 months. I wouldn't recommend night weaning before 12 months when your child has a bit more language and comprehension as well, because a lot of my methods worked on really talking it out with her and explaining why we were spacing out those feeds. So if your kid is over 12 months, 18 months worked really well for us. Her level of understanding was really good, and she was just ready for it. And her language was quite good at 18 months. So I was able to night wean really, really easily. And I'm going to make a whole nother video on night weaning and the resources that I read to prepare myself for night weaning. I'll talk more about that Nurses When the Sun Shines book. And ultimately what we did, because we chose a bit more of an abrupt method, but I still felt like it was really gentle. So I'm gonna make another video on that. So I do really think that night weaning is the most effective way to get your period back. If you're really wanting it back, that's going to have the most impact, because you can get the longest period of time without feeds stimulating your hormone levels to change and suppress your ovulation. The second thing you can try is spacing out the feeds like we did. Now, you can use that really gentle method. Those 3 tips are really helpful for gently spacing out the feeds. But when my period had returned, I actually chose to specifically pull her back to 3 feeds a day. She now feeds when she first wakes up in the morning, when she goes down for her nap in the afternoon, and when she goes to sleep at night. And I liked that because kids don't work with a clock time, but they can understand a concept like that you get a feed at when you wake up, when you go to bed. Like that's an easier concept for her to understand. And she was 2, but I do think you could do it with an 18-month-old, particularly if they've got a bit of language. You'd be able to explain that. And I really focused on, once I decided to do that, I just decided to do it. I know a lot of people like to introduce concepts slowly, but in my mind, it was confusing. To explain something to her but not actually do it was going to confuse her, rather than just saying, this is what we're doing. And so I did that, and I was very understanding, and I had lots of lots of things ready, lots of yogurt and things ready to give her if she was hungry, and a lot of comfort, because a child that's fed like my child was is asking for a feed for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes it's boredom, sometimes it's because they're hungry, sometimes it's because they're hurt, and sometimes it's because they actually really want to connect with you. So just having an awareness of why are they asking to feed, and you can gently remind them, when do you get your next feed? At nap time. So let's do something else. Let's come up with another idea. So depending on how quickly you're wanting your fertility to return, I know a lot of mothers are much older than me when they get started, and they do want to have their children a bit more quickly. Then you could try the gentle method that I talked about earlier, or you could try those 3 specific times and weaning back to that. And obviously with the extra hours between feeds that's going to create, then your fertility is much more likely to return. And with any of these changes, be aware that you need to give yourself a few months. So just recognize that if you do make a change, night weaning or spacing out those day feeds, give it probably a good 6 to 8 weeks to really give your body a chance to get your period back. There are a very small number of women who will have to completely wean to get pregnant. It's going to take you time to figure out if you are one of those women. So be patient with the process, but also I wish you luck with making some of these changes and conceiving your next child. So I hope this is helpful in giving you some ideas for how you might be able to get pregnant while breastfeeding. And I look forward to seeing you in my next video. I am doing weekly pregnancy updates, and of course I will have that night weaning video coming out, because night weaning was actually a really positive experience for us. We didn't get screaming and all of that stuff. So I'll be talking about night weaning and lots of other fun things. So if you're not subscribed already, make sure you subscribe, and I will see you next time. Bye.